Hey everybody, it's Krissa. It's Bad at Keeping Secrets. I'm here with Cassie Holmes. Um, do you say would you prefer I say like professor? How would you introduce yourself?
I guess to a classroom professor, Cassie Holmes, but call me Cassie. That's easy.
Sounds great. This is Cassie, everyone. This is your first book, right? Have you read?
Yes, it is my first. And I'm like, at this point, I'm like, it's based off of my entire career of my research. So I've been working in this space and conducting research on time and happiness for the last 15 years. And I've been teaching a course, applying the science of happiness to life design, to our MBAs and executive MBAs at UCLA for the last 4 years. And then spent basically the last 2 years writing it all into a book so that more people can learn from the empirical insights. And it was a lot of time but absolutely worth it. And I'm really excited and proud that it's out in the world to help people be happier, spend their hours happily, for greater satisfaction in life. But I keep telling my husband, I'm like, mark my words, I'm not going to write another book. But in all honesty, probably in a few years, I will decide, there's more things to share. So I will write a book. But yes, my first book.
I think this reminds me of a part in the book where you talk about how humans are tragically bad at predicting what they'll want to do and what their time will look like in the future. Can you talk a little bit about that research? Because it seems like an interesting segue. And it also, when I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is absolutely true. I say yes to everything in the moment. And then in the future, I'm like,
yes, we are all prone to this. So there's really interesting work by Gall Zuberman and John Lynch. And what they found was the effect is called the yes, damn effect. But the psychology of that effect is that we tend to, if I ask you to do something today, you're like, I'm so sorry, I don't have time. But if I asked you to do something in a month from now, you're like, sure, because it's easier to say yes than no. And we have this tendency to think that we will have more time in the future than we have today. Interestingly, we're more prone to this, predicting we will have more abundance in the future than today for time than we are for money. People generally know that in a month from now, they won't have any more money like in the future than they have today. But we have this sense that in the future, I will have more time, even though you won't, because a month before you were saying yes to all of those requests for that later date. So they called it sort of jokingly the yes, damn effect, because it's very easy to say yes for things in the future. Then when comes the time that it's time to actually do it, you're like, damn, because you are equally as busy that day than you, as you are the day, sort of the previous day.
I think it's interesting. So most of the people, I think, just to give you a little background about what our audience may or may not be interested, what I think our audience is interested in, and maybe it's just what I'm interested in sort of embracing all the full spectrum of emotion, but also having a toolkit to be able to, I don't know, feel some agency in life, I guess. And also the intersections of sort of mood with creativity. And I think for me, the thing that's interesting about this work, I mean, there's lots of things that are interesting, but I find the different correlation between like how we value our time and as a resource. I don't typically think about, it's not natural for me to think about my time as a resource and how I spend it. And could you talk a little bit about the reframe of how you think about using your time in the present moment? That makes sense?
Yeah. And I do talk about it, and particularly because I'm a professor at a business school, and my initial dissertation work was comparing time to money. And obviously everyone thinks about money as a resource, as something that we invest. But I would, in my work, I highlight the importance of recognizing the value of time as also a resource to invest, to spend in ways such that immediately there are outcomes that feel worthwhile, as well as it's investing in yourself and your satisfaction in the future going forward. And I talk about my work as being about happiness as the thing that we're striving for. But when I'm using the word happiness, I'm talking about what we talk about as subjective well-being, which involves both that emotional component of the joy we feel in the moment, but it also involves this cognitive evaluative component of feeling satisfied about your life overall, about your days. And so really what I hope to help people to strive to do is to invest their time, the minutes, the hours, and of course our hours add up to our days, our weeks, our years, our life overall. So it's the sort of fabric of our life in such a way that we feel fulfilled, satisfied, looking back on our days. We feel like that time was worthwhile. And when I say worthwhile, that is, according to the individual, worthwhile that it did make you feel joy, that it did bring a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. So that is really sort of the goal of my work, is how do we invest the hours of our days to feel more satisfied in our lives?
I think that's a really important reframe, I feel like, at this moment, and not feeling this tremendous pressure to feel happy all the time or one emotion predominantly. And I think, can you talk a little bit more about how you would define subjective well-being? Because I don't know if I've heard that term before.
Yeah, and it's a term that is often used in the psychology literature as well as behavioral economics. And what's interesting, it's that it's well-being, but it's according to the individual person. So that's where the subjectivity. So I can ask you, how are you feeling? How satisfied are you about? And so that is experiencing more positive than negative emotion in the day-to-day, as well as a greater sense of satisfaction and positive emotion about your days or your life overall. So it has both of those components, and meaning is a construct that is tightly tied to that satisfaction, that evaluation. And meaning, interestingly, happiness is the single biggest predictor in the extent to which, if I asked you, do you have meaning in your life? Do you feel a sense of meaning? But also negative experiences can contribute to one's sense of meaning if one learns from it, if one feels that they've grown from it. And so you don't need happiness every moment to feel a great sense of satisfaction and meaning. But we have agency. I think it's really important to your point of highlighting our role of choice and agency and really how satisfied we are and how happy we are. Because actually, if you look at what are the inputs into, I'm going to use the term happiness for subjective well-being, but recognizing what I'm talking about is also that satisfaction. What are the inputs of how we feel in our days and how we feel about our lives? Our genetic disposition has a big effect. So we don't have control over whether we were born as sort of chronically, naturally more positive, cheery type person versus grumpy. There's also an influence of our circumstances. So these are things we don't have immediate control over, like income level, marital status, how attractive you are. And interestingly, those things have a significantly less powerful of an effect on how we feel than many think, because people are like, if only I had a lot of money, then I'd be super happy and forever. If only I found someone to marry, then I'd be super happy forever. And research shows that those things have a small effect, but significantly smaller than we predict. Now, the third category, which is the one that I'm most interested in, that influences how we feel in our days and how satisfied we feel about our lives, is up to our discretion. It is what we do and what we focus on and think about in the day-to-day. And I frame it with respect to time. How do we spend our time and how are we mentally approaching, and our mindset during that time that we spend has a significant influence on how we feel in our days and how joyful and satisfied we feel about our lives. And so that is what my research is looking to inform. What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing? Where do we draw our attention? And interestingly, I think the really exciting thing and a big sort of takeaway from my work is that there's a lot of joy and happiness in the ordinary day-to-day moments that we're already investing our time in. Yes, we do need to prioritize those times, but it's also, we need to be paying attention and not be distracted during them. Because research also points to the fact that we are often distracted. 47% of the time, that's almost half the time, we are not thinking about what we're currently doing. And if you're doing something that's enjoyable and potentially joyful, and you're not even paying attention, then you're missing out on that time that you were already spending in that particular way.
Well, I really like this. I like to think about having more agency over our happiness and joy and choosing how to spend our time. Can you talk, there's a graph in the beginning of the book about sort of a sweet spot of free time that you can kind of exist within. Can you maybe define what you mean by that, and then also what that is?
Yeah, and it's a really it was an important takeaway for me personally, because going into that work, like so many, I think, and actually not even I think, we have research to show, I felt really time poor. So using, again, a sort of resource laden term, but there's just this feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it. And in those days of having young kids, having a career that I'm working really hard towards, I want to be a good partner, I want to be a good parent, I want to be a good friend, the never-ending pile of chores. It all feels like there's too much to do and not enough time to do it, let alone do any of it well, let alone to enjoy any of it along the way. And it was in sort of one of those days that were just so hectic. I was like, oh gosh, the answer is to quit, right? If only I quit my job,
yeah,
then I would be happier because I'd have all the time to spend exactly how I wanted. But then I was like, before I quit, I was like, is it true that people who have a whole lot more time, are they in fact happier? And so what we did with my colleagues, Hal Hirschfield and Marissa Sharif, we looked at what's the relationship between the amount of discretionary time people have in their regular days and their happiness or their satisfaction. In one of the data sets, we analyzed a regular day from tens of thousands of working as well as non-working Americans. And this is the American Time Use Survey. And from that, we calculated how much time did they spend on discretionary activities, that is, activities that people want to do as opposed to non-discretionary or obligations, things that people have to do. And what we found was this really interesting shape. It was like an upside down U or a rainbow, suggesting that it goes down. Our happiness is lower on both ends of the spectrum. Yes, people with too little discretionary time are less happy. But what was really interesting was that on the other side, there is such thing as having too much time. People in this data set with more than approximately 5 hours of discretionary time in the day also were less happy. And digging into that, it suggested that the data points to we are averse to being idle. So when we have all the hours of a regular day, and this isn't vacation, this isn't a day on the weekend, this is your day-to-day life, that you have a lot of time to spend relaxing, doing nothing, etc., that people are less happy because that undermines their sense of purpose. And from that, they feel less satisfied. And so the sweet spot that you're referring to is, at least in that data, there's a pretty wide range, except at the extremes, that between 2 and 5 hours approximately of discretionary time in the day, it's actually flat. There's no relationship between the amount of time you have and your happiness, which is suggesting that it's not about how much time you have available. It's really about how you invest and spend the time you have available. It's not for the answer for greater satisfaction and fulfillment. It's not about actually being time rich. It's about making the time that you spend feel rich. And so that is what then propelled the rest of my research agenda, as well as the book. How do we invest our hours so that our time feels rich, so that the time feels worthwhile and not like a waste? And so if you're looking back on your days, yes, you will likely be busy, but instead of your days just being full but not fulfilling, you look back and you're like, I was busy, but I invested in things that really mattered to me, in those relationships, in work that sort of aligned with my purpose. And from that, folks can feel greater satisfaction and happiness.
I think for me, all of this is really interesting. I kind of want you, I'm torn with, I know we don't have much more time, but what a discretionary activity is, and maybe a list of them. But also the thing that I really felt like was really, I don't know, hit home for me when reading the book was how much relationships matter. And I find that I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like I've been taught that work matters and obligations matter, and then everything else sort of falls, especially like exercise and maintaining friendships and relationships with people I care about. I think if I were to look back on my time, I think that I would definitely regret not prioritizing people over projects. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the role of being social and the importance of relationships in happiness or subjective well-being, I guess.
It is so profoundly important, our relationships, having that genuine sense of connection, and that requires investment. And even if you look at the time tracking research of looking at how people are spending their days and how they feel over the course of their days, people on average tend to be the happiest when they are socially connecting, whether sort of intimately or socializing, spending time with family and friends. But notably, not all forms of socializing are as rewarding and fulfilling and actually feel connecting. And so what I suggest people do is actually to track their own time over the course of a week, writing down what you're doing, what's the activity, as well as how you're feeling. And then from that, you can pull out what are those activities that are the most positive, satisfying for you. And you'll likely identify that it is social connection, but for you, you'll pull out what are those ways of connecting that are really, that really do feel worthwhile, that increase that sense of belonging. And I mean, just to highlight the point in several other different ways of just how important our relationships are. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, on the very bottom, these basic physiological needs, health, safety, food, water. But the most basic psychological need is having that sense of belonging, having that sense of connection. And only when you have those relationships that are there that are supporting, and you have that genuine source of the connection, then you sort of move up the pyramid to competence and self-actualization, where you're sort of aligning your skills and talents with your purpose, which absolutely we want to strive for. But it's not going to be very fun when you reach the top if you have no one there to celebrate, with you. Also, there's interesting longitudinal work tracking a cohort of men over 75 years, initially in Boston, some Harvard students, have very different lives. And what they found is they would sort of connect with them every few years, ask how they're doing, what they're doing. The single biggest predictor of life satisfaction was not money, nor was it fame, these things that, we're working really hard towards. It was whether they had strong supportive relationships with family or with people who feel like family. And so it just goes to the point that we need to invest in these relationships now. And it's so easy to respond to what seems urgent, that work dinner, those emails that are coming in, those projects that have deadlines. And sometimes those things are also important, but we're responding to what's urgent, irrespective of its importance. Whereas there are also these ways of investing that are really important that don't initially seem urgent, like spending the time with your kids, that sort of family dinner. If you counted how many times do you actually have left to sit down with your family in that particular way, where I know you have a 3-year-old, so maybe they're not super jazzed about sitting at the table for more than like 3 seconds. But there will be a time, my kids are at this stage where actually dinners are so fun because we're all sitting down and we are talking and laughing. And if I counted how many of these family dinners do we actually have left before the kids are going to, have their evening activities of sports and stuff, so we won't be sitting down, during the week, then they're going to go off to college, then they're going to live across the country. And more often than not, when you calculate what percentage of times do you have left, is significantly less than you predict. And by recognizing that, it makes these important things, like our relationships with the people around us, we realize not only are they important, but they are actually more urgent than we think. So with that recognition, it motivates us to invest in our time with those people and pay attention during it, because you realize just how precious that time is.
So I know we're a little bit over time, but can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so there was I think in the book somewhere, it's a sort of 3 steps that you can kind of immediately take. And I think part of the book I think the book is amazingly accessible, and reads, it's a very fun, the anecdotes feel like really perfect and relatable. And then also, maybe it's just also that where I'm at in my time of life. But so there's 3 things right now that you feel like you can kind of do to improve your happiness, your time right now. Can you talk a little bit about what the 3 things are? Because they felt like really accessible and easy, and sort of ways that one could boost their mood now.
Yeah. In terms of spending your time in 3 particular ways that feel worthwhile, social connection. So spend time with people that you love and enjoy, but when you're spending the time, fully have those good conversations. Put your phone away, make it a no phone zone, because phones actually increase our distraction even more. So put your phone away, have those good conversations, be in the moment, invest in those relationships that matter to you in a way that does. Exercise. Exercise is another activity that has been shown to be a significant mood booster. It helps offset anxiety. Oftentimes when we exercise, we're outside. Being outside also, research shows, is a significant mood booster, irrespective of the weather outside. Irrespective of actually, yes, it's an even bigger effect when you're in a natural environment versus an urban environment. But even in urban environments, getting outside will boost your mood. So the best thing is you exercise, go for a walk or a run with someone you really love and have a great conversation with outside. So you it's a triple whammy in that regard.
Oh no, I love it. And actually, when I was reading the book earlier this week, it created a really strong argument to reach out to a good friend of mine, Leah, to make a swim date.
Because fun.
The joy of spending time with Leah and swimming bundled, this was just like, oh, I really need to prioritize this, because I think again, I know I will feel better afterwards. Cassie, thank you so much for doing all this research and for writing Happier Hour. I know it was a lot of work for you, but I'm really excited for whatever you decide to write next, if you decide to write under. And I'll put all of your contact information for your website and your work, where people can check you out and find you, in the notes. So thank you so much for
Awesome.
doing this with me. It was really a pleasure meeting you, and finding out about your research.
It was a treat. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.